Arjun Mehta, a strict and ambitious father; Priya Mehta, a worried and helpless mother; Rohan Mehta, a bright but anxious teenager; and Detective Lisa Carter, a determined investigator. Each of their lives would collide in a tragedy that no one saw coming. In a quiet New Jersey suburb, the Mehta family seemed ordinary, even successful. But behind closed doors, pressure, fear, and obsession were building, pushing a young boy to the breaking point and setting the stage for a crime so shocking it would leave a community and a nation stunned. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. Arjun Mehta had arrived in the United States a decade ago with nothing but a suitcase, a stubborn determination, and dreams of giving his family a life he had never known in India. He settled in a quiet suburban neighborhood in New Jersey, a place that seemed peaceful but held the hidden tensions of a family struggling to adapt. His wife, Priya, had followed him willingly, leaving behind her family and familiar surroundings, believing that together they could build something better. Their 18-year-old son, Rohan, had been born in the United States, but Arjun always reminded him that he needed to honor his Indian roots by striving for excellence in every aspect of life. Arjun was known in the neighborhood as a polite and hardworking man, always in crisp shirts and neatly combed hair, walking with a purposeful stride that suggested discipline and order. Yet, behind the polite exterior, he was a man with rigid expectations and little tolerance for failure. Neighbors had occasionally noticed the tension when Rohan returned home from school. The boy would retreat to his room immediately, slamming the door in a way that seemed louder than necessary, as if trying to shut out more than just noise. Friends sometimes called, only to be told he was studying or resting, but the hesitancy in Rohan's voice was impossible to ignore. Rohan's relationship with his father was complex. He loved him, but he also feared him. Arjun's love was conditional, measured in grades, achievements, and visible success. Any mistake or moment of weakness was met with criticism that left deep marks on Rohan's psyche. He often found himself lying awake at night, calculating the ways he could meet his father's expectations, knowing that falling short might trigger a storm of anger he could not control. Priya watched silently, aware of the growing strain, but unsure how to intervene. She feared the consequences of challenging Arjun, knowing his temper and his unshakable belief that failure was unacceptable. Despite this, Arjun's outward persona remained intact. At the local temple, he was the model father, greeting others warmly, engaging in charity events, and attending community functions. He spoke about hard work, perseverance, and the importance of education, offering advice that seemed thoughtful and inspiring. But inside the walls of his home, the pressure was relentless. Rohan felt trapped between the image of the ideal son his father wanted and the reality of a teenager struggling to meet impossible standards. The tension between father and son grew silently over the years, unnoticed by anyone outside the family. Rohan's friends described him as polite and quiet, rarely expressing his frustrations, always trying to hide the cracks in his emotional armor. But beneath the surface, fear and anxiety were constant companions. Every test, every report card, every minor disappointment carried the weight of Arjun's expectations. It was a pressure that no young adult should have to bear, yet Rohan had carried it alone for years, unsure of how much longer he could endure. Arjun believed he was doing the right thing, that his sternness was preparing Rohan for a successful life. But the seeds of fear, resentment, and quiet desperation were growing in Rohan, slowly twisting the bond between father and son into something fragile and dangerous. In the neighborhood, life continued as usual, unaware that behind the doors of the Mehta household, a storm was quietly building, one that would soon erupt in a way that no one could have imagined. Rohan Mehta had been preparing for his final mathematics exam for months, but no amount of study seemed enough to quiet the anxiety gnawing at him. Every night, he sat at his desk under the dim light of a lamp, flipping through textbooks and scribbling formulas, only to feel the numbers blur before his eyes. The pressure from his father, Arjun, was relentless. Every question Rohan asked was met with impatience or a sharp reminder that failure was not an option. The house was filled with a tense silence most days, broken only by the rustle of papers or the ticking of the clock, each second marking another moment closer to judgment. Arjun rarely raised his voice, but the weight of his expectations was suffocating. He believed that strictness and discipline were the keys to success, and that Rohan's future depended entirely on his ability to excel academically. There was no room for mistakes, no allowance for human error, and certainly no space for weakness. Rohan often imagined how different life might have been if his father had offered guidance instead of threats disguised as motivation. Yet he dared not voice such thoughts, knowing that any display of doubt would only intensify his father's scrutiny. The night before the exam, Rohan could barely sleep. He reviewed formulas over and over, but anxiety clouded his memory. Each incorrect answer he imagined on the test filled him with dread. In the quiet of his room, he whispered to himself, trying to summon confidence, but the words felt hollow. Priya, his mother, passed by the doorway, silently watching him struggle. She wished she could intervene, wished she could shield her son from the relentless pressure, but she felt powerless. Arjun had always been the authority in the household, and confronting him directly was unthinkable. The morning of the exam arrived with a chilling stillness. Arjun drove Rohan to school, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The car was silent except for the low hum of the engine. Rohan stared out the window, trying to distract himself with passing trees and houses, but his mind kept returning to the inevitable moment when he would have to face his father with the results. Arjun said nothing, offering neither reassurance nor encouragement, and the quiet seemed heavier than words could express. Rohan felt trapped, a small figure burdened by the weight of his father's expectations, heading toward a day that would define the balance between fear and hope. At school, Rohan entered the classroom, the exam papers laid out before him like a battlefield. He tried to focus, but the panic that had been building for weeks clouded his thoughts. Each question felt like a test, not just of knowledge, but of worth. As if passing or failing would determine whether he was deserving of his father's approval. As he scribbled answers, the numbers on the page seemed to mock him, twisting into forms he could not recognize. By the time he handed in his paper, Rohan felt hollow, as if the effort he had made was invisible, meaningless. When the results were announced, his fears materialized. He had failed. The thought of returning home and facing Arjun was unbearable. Each step back to the car was heavier than the last, filled with dread and an unspoken anticipation of his father's anger. Rohan felt trapped in a cage built of expectations and discipline, unsure of how he would survive the consequences of one exam that had become so much more than a test. When Rohan returned home that afternoon, the house felt unusually quiet, almost waiting for him. The air was thick with tension, and he could sense his father's presence before even stepping through the door. Arjun had been waiting, standing in the hallway, arms crossed, his face unreadable. The silence between them was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Rohan's stomach churned with anxiety. He knew that this was the moment he had been dreading for weeks, the moment when all his fears would collide with reality. He tried to steady his shaking hands as he reached for the exam paper. The failure stared back at him in black and white, each mark a judgment on his worth. He hesitated, hopping against hope that his father might be understanding, might show even the slightest hint of sympathy. But Arjun's eyes were sharp, cold, and unyielding, reflecting nothing but disappointment. The words Rohan feared most were already forming in his mind, echoing the countless warnings and reprimands he had endured over the years. Finally, Rohan whispered the truth, barely audible. He had failed. The moment the words left his lips, Arjun's expression shifted, though not in the way anyone might expect. There was no shouting, no immediate outburst, just a sudden, chilling stillness. It was a silence heavier than any anger, one that made Rohan's chest tighten and his heart race. Arjun took a step closer, his eyes fixed on his son, and in that moment, Rohan realized that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The disappointment radiating from his father was suffocating, and fear wrapped around him like a cold, unrelenting grip. The hours that followed were a torment of subtle threats and oppressive control. Arjun paced the living room, occasionally glancing at Rohan, who remained frozen in a corner, too afraid to speak. Priya watched from the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly, unsure how to intervene. She knew that the tension was building, that something had shifted inside her husband, something dark and unpredictable. Rohan could feel it too, a storm brewing just beneath the surface, one that he could not escape. That night the household seemed to close in on him. Arjun locked the doors, insisting that Rohan stay in his room until they could discuss the situation in the morning. But the discussion never came. Instead, the hours stretched endlessly, each minute amplifying Rohan's fear. He tried to think of ways to calm his father, to reason with him, but every strategy felt inadequate, every plan hopeless. The walls of his room felt like a prison, the faint creaks of the house echoing the threat that loomed over him. Outside, the neighborhood carried on as usual, unaware of the storm raging within the Mehta home. Inside, a father's expectations and a son's fear collided in a tense, dangerous silence. Rohan knew that this failure was more than a simple academic setback. It had become a fracture in their relationship, one that could not easily be repaired. And somewhere deep in the shadows of Arjun's mind, the line between discipline and obsession was already blurring, inching toward a darkness that Rohan could sense, but could not yet fully comprehend. By the time the night crept toward early morning, the tension had reached a breaking point. The fear that had been simmering under the surface for months transformed into something heavier, a force that seemed to dominate the air around them. Rohan lay awake, heart pounding, aware that his life as he knew it had changed forever, unaware that the events set in motion by a single failed exam would soon lead to a tragedy no one could have imagined. The next morning, Priya awoke to a quiet house, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, almost too heavy. Rohan's bed was empty, and the sheets were rumpled as if he had left in a hurry. She called his name softly at first, then louder, her voice trembling with growing unease. The house echoed back only silence. Something felt wrong. Her mind raced through possibilities. Maybe he had gone for a walk, or perhaps he had gone to a friend's house, but instinct told her that this absence was different, darker, something that could not be explained so simply. When Arjun appeared in the kitchen, he seemed calm, almost too calm, as if the world outside was entirely separate from the chaos brewing inside. He claimed that Rohan must have run away, that teenagers often made impulsive decisions when stressed or scared. Priya wanted to argue, wanted to demand that he help her find their son, but she felt an invisible weight pressing down on her. There was something in Arjun's tone, the quiet certainty with which he spoke, that made her fear asking too many questions. It was not the calm of reassurance, it was the calm of control. Priya searched the house frantically, opening closets, checking every room, even looking in the basement and attic, calling Rohan's name with a voice that cracked under panic. The windows were closed, except for the slight one left ajar in his bedroom, but there were no signs that he had left through it voluntarily. Nothing was missing from the room, no signs of packing or preparation for leaving. Her heart pounded in her chest as the fear transformed into dread. Her son had vanished, and she had no idea how or why. Neighbors were called, and soon the street filled with concerned faces. They had known Rohan as a quiet, polite boy, rarely causing trouble, always respectful. The idea that he could have disappeared voluntarily seemed strange to them, yet they listened, worried, as Priya recounted the morning and the tense events leading up to his disappearance. People offered help and comfort, but each suggestion that he might have run away only deepened Priya's unease. Deep down, she knew something far worse might have happened. The police arrived quickly, taking statements and canvassing the neighborhood for any clues. Officers questioned Arjun, who maintained his story with unnerving composure. He claimed that Rohan's stress over school and the failed exam had driven him to leave, that he had likely sought solitude or companionship elsewhere. But detectives noticed subtle inconsistencies, timing, minor details that did not align, and most concerning, Arjun's calm demeanor. Most parents in his situation would have been frantic, panicked. Arjun's composure suggested something else, something carefully rehearsed. As the day stretched into night, Priya sat in Rohan's empty room, clutching a small blanket he had left behind. Every creak of the house, every shadow in the dim light, seemed to hint at an explanation too terrible to voice aloud. The sense of dread grew heavier with each passing hour, as the possibility that her son had not merely run away became impossible to ignore. Outside, life continued as usual, unaware of the invisible nightmare consuming one family. a nightmare that was quietly, chillingly, unfolding behind locked doors. Detective Lisa Carter had seen her fair share of missing person cases, but there was something unsettling about Rohan Mehta's disappearance. From the moment she stepped into the Mehta household, she sensed that the surface calm masked a deeper, darker truth. The house smelled faintly of antiseptic and cold air, yet there was a tension that clung to the walls, an almost physical heaviness that made her skin prickle. Priya's quiet fear, the way she wrung her hands and avoided looking directly at Arjun, told Lisa more than any statement could. This was not just a missing teenager, this was a family on the edge. Lisa began by reviewing school records and speaking with Rohan's teachers. They described him as intelligent, diligent, but deeply anxious, often withdrawn when his father's expectations weighed heavily on him. The failing mathematics exam, which seemed minor to an outsider, had been a crushing blow in the context of his father's unyielding pressure. Every teacher mentioned Arjun, the father who visited often, who questioned assignments and demanded excellence. Strict but loving, they would say, unaware that strictness had long crossed into obsession. Neighbors added pieces to the puzzle, some recalling loud arguments late at night, others noting that Rohan rarely left the house on his own. One neighbor mentioned seeing Arjun leave late at night a few days before the disappearance, carrying a large duffel bag, though they had dismissed it at the time. The seemingly mundane observation now took on a sinister meaning. Lisa felt the first threads of suspicion twisting around Arjun, the father whose calm demeanor had unsettled her from the beginning. Back at the house, detectives combed through every room. They found Rohan's personal items neatly arranged, his backpack untouched, and his phone lying on the desk. No signs of a struggle, no letters, no messages indicating he had planned to leave. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. But Lisa noticed subtle details, the slight misalignment of a picture frame, a faint scuff on the hallway floor, and the locked doors of the house that night. Each small clue suggested planning, a careful effort to manipulate appearances. The investigation deepened when Lisa examined Arjun's digital footprint. His internet history contained searches that were unsettling, phrases about controlling children, how to keep someone confined, and the consequences of disobedience. It painted a picture of a father whose obsession with control had reached an alarming intensity. Lisa felt a growing conviction that this disappearance was no random act. Someone had planned it, and the calm, collected father was at the center of it. As days passed, the search for Rohan became increasingly desperate. Flyers were posted, social media alerts sent, and volunteers scoured nearby parks and forests. Yet nothing surfaced. The more Lisa investigated, the more she realized that the clues left behind were not accidental. They were carefully placed, designed to mislead, to create the illusion of a runaway. But for Lisa, the story was becoming clear. Rohan's disappearance was a calculated act, and every small inconsistency, every nervous glance from Arjun, pointed to a horrifying possibility that no one in the neighborhood was yet ready to accept. By the end of the week, Lisa's investigation had shifted from hope to grim determination. She knew that finding Rohan alive was increasingly unlikely, and uncovering the truth meant confronting the very person who had seemed to embody the American dream, the ideal father. But behind closed doors was hiding something far more terrifying. The case was no longer about a missing child. It had become a chilling puzzle, a race against time to uncover the darkness festering within a family that, from the outside, seemed normal. A week after Rohan's disappearance, the community had grown increasingly anxious. Flyers covered every street lamp and bulletin board, social media posts were shared hundreds of times, and the police had expanded the search to nearby woods, abandoned buildings, and rivers. Despite the efforts, hope was fading. Lisa Carter, however, refused to give in to despair. She knew the signs of premeditation, and the evidence suggested that Rohan's disappearance was not random. Someone had planned this carefully, and she was determined to uncover the truth. It was a hiker, taking an unfamiliar trail through a dense forest about 30 minutes from the Mehta residence, who stumbled upon the first horrifying clue. Hidden beneath a tarp in a small, abandoned cabin, he saw what looked like a bundle of blankets. At first, he thought it was discarded bedding, but the smell and the unnatural stillness suggested something far worse. Authorities were called immediately, and Lisa was among the first on the scene. Her heart sank as she approached the cabin, the chilling reality of what awaited her pressing down with each step. Inside, the scene was nightmarish. Beneath the blankets lay Rohan's body, pale and lifeless, his eyes closed as if he were asleep. Signs of strangulation were evident, and the medical examiner confirmed that death had occurred several days prior, dating precisely to the night of his disappearance. Every piece of the puzzle fell into place in the most horrifying way. The fear, the tension, the obsessive control Arjun had exercised, all of it had led to this unspeakable tragedy. Lisa felt a wave of sorrow for Rohan, a boy who had been trapped by love twisted into control, and for Priya, who now faced a reality worse than any nightmare. Back at the Mehta home, Priya received the news like a physical blow. She sank into a chair, unable to cry or speak, as the weight of her son's death crushed her. Friends and neighbors gathered, offering comfort, but the grief was too immense to soothe. The revelation shook the local Indian community. Questions spread like wildfire. How could a father, who had sacrificed so much to build a life in America, commit such an act over a failed exam? The tragedy seemed incomprehensible, yet the evidence was undeniable. Lisa Carter continued her investigation with grim determination. The cabin's isolation suggested planning. It was not a crime of impulse. Ropes, bindings, and materials used to conceal Rohan's body indicated that the murderer had thought through every step, ensuring that no immediate evidence would link the crime to him. The detectives also discovered items in the duffel bag that neighbors had noticed Arjun carrying days before, confirming suspicions that he had been preparing for something unimaginable. The story captivated national attention. Headlines highlighted the pressure some immigrant families place on children and the dangerous extremes of parental control. Psychologists and community leaders weighed in, trying to make sense of how ambition, fear, and obsession could culminate in murder. Yet beneath the analysis and media coverage, the truth was stark and simple. Rohan Mehta was dead, the victim of a father's uncontrollable rage, and the quiet suburban life that had seemed safe and ordinary had been shattered forever. Arjun Mehta was arrested quietly, without resistance, as if he had been expecting the moment all along. The police arrived at his door early in the morning, armed with warrants and evidence collected over the past week. Arjun stood calmly, his face composed, his hands folded in front of him. There was no panic, no denial, no pleading for understanding. It was a stillness that unnerved even the most experienced officers. Inside the house, detectives meticulously documented every room, every item, searching for anything that could piece together the final moments leading to Rohan's death. The investigation revealed chilling details. In Arjun's room and study, authorities found notes and writings that indicated a carefully constructed plan. There were lists detailing what he would do if Rohan disobeyed, reminders of how to maintain control, and searches on the internet about restraining children and methods of confinement. Police discovered ropes, cords, and plastic ties hidden in drawers, evidence that suggested premeditation rather than a spontaneous act of anger. Every item painted a picture of a father whose obsession with discipline had escalated far beyond reason, transforming love into lethal control. Priya's testimony provided further insight into the home's hidden tensions. She described years of escalating fear, the subtle manipulations, the quiet punishments, and the obsessive monitoring of Rohan's every move. She admitted that she had feared Arjun for years, but never imagined it would culminate in murder. Her words were heavy with guilt, sorrow, and disbelief. The neighbors' statements corroborated her fears, noting that Arjun's demeanor had shifted over time, from strictness to a form of coercive dominance, a pressure that Rohan could not withstand. The media seized upon the case immediately. National headlines labeled it shocking and unprecedented, focusing on the cultural pressures and immigrant experience that had intersected tragically with parental obsession. Psychologists were interviewed, highlighting the dangers of authoritarian parenting and perfectionism pushed to extremes. Yet beneath the societal analysis, the human story remained devastatingly simple. A father, consumed by control, had taken the life of his own son. Arjun remained calm throughout the initial questioning. Detectives noted that he answered questions with precision, never wavering, never showing remorse. It was as if the act had been justified in his own mind, a necessary step to enforce discipline and maintain the standards he had always demanded. For the authorities, this composure was disturbing. It revealed not guilt that could lead to confession, but a deep-seated conviction, a dangerous certainty that the crime was warranted. As the investigation progressed, forensic evidence linked Arjun directly to the cabin where Rohan had been found. Fingerprints, fibers, and digital traces confirmed the timeline, painting a damning picture of premeditation. The combination of psychological profiling, physical evidence, and witness statements created an airtight case. Lisa Carter, who had first sensed the danger, finally saw the full scope of the crime. What had begun as a missing child case had evolved into a chilling portrait of obsession and control, culminating in a murder that would haunt the community for years. Arjun Mehta was charged with first-degree murder, and the case moved toward trial. The once respected father, the man who had embodied the promise of the American dream for his family, was now a figure of horror and disbelief. Priya left the house to return to India, seeking distance from the tragedy and the man she had once trusted. The neighborhood was left grappling with the realization that darkness can hide behind even the most ordinary facades, and that fear and obsession can turn a parent into a killer. The trial of Arjun Mehta became the focus of national attention. News outlets reported every detail, analyzing the psychological, cultural, and familial pressures that had culminated in tragedy. Yet behind the headlines, the devastation was deeply personal. Priya, now back in India with relatives, struggled to reconcile the memory of the man she had loved with the father who had killed their son. The house in New Jersey, once a symbol of hope and hard work, remained empty and silent, filled only with the echoes of a family destroyed from within. For the community, the revelation of Rohan's death was more than shocking, it was a wake-up call. Parents began questioning the limits of discipline, the dangers of perfectionism, and the consequences of unspoken pressures on their children. Friends of Rohan remembered him as a bright, quiet boy who smiled easily but carried a hidden weight. They shared stories of his laughter, his small acts of kindness, and his dreams of a life beyond fear. Each memory was bittersweet, a reminder of the potential lost to an obsession that had escalated beyond reason. Psychologists and child advocates emphasized the warning signs that had been visible for years. Rohan's anxiety, his withdrawal, and his fear of disappointing his father were classic indicators of a child under extreme pressure. The case sparked conversations about mental health, particularly within immigrant communities, where expectations of success can become suffocating. Families began to examine their own patterns, recognizing the delicate balance between encouragement and coercion, and the devastating consequences when that balance is lost. Meanwhile, Arjun Mehta awaited trial, isolated from the world he had once navigated with apparent ease. The man who had once embodied the promise of a better life now faced the consequences of his actions. His calm, calculated demeanor remained, but beneath it was a stark awareness that his choices had destroyed everything he had worked to build. The legal system would determine his fate. But the emotional consequences extended far beyond the courtroom. Priya, the neighbors, and the wider community all bore the weight of a tragedy that could not be undone. In an effort to preserve Rohan's memory, friends and classmates established a scholarship in his name. The fund aimed to support students struggling under academic pressure, a way to honor a life cut short and to provide hope to others navigating similar challenges. Each year, the scholarship reminded the community of the fine line between encouragement and obsession, and the urgent need to protect children from the hidden dangers of extreme expectations. The story of Rohan Mehta remains a haunting reminder that sometimes the most dangerous threats come from those we trust the most. A father's love, when twisted by control and obsession, can transform into something deadly. The tragedy reverberated far beyond a single household, sparking reflection on parenting, mental health, and the pressures faced by children striving to meet impossible standards. Even as the case faded from the headlines, the memory of Rohan and the lessons of his life lingered. Families, communities, and authorities were left to grapple with the uncomfortable truth. Tragedy often hides behind ordinary doors, and the consequences of fear, control, and obsession can be irreversible. Rohan's story became more than a news item. It became a cautionary tale, a plea to recognize the signs before it is too late, and a somber testament to the fragility of life under relentless pressure.